We're going to start with lighting our chalice. This is our tradition. Symbol of light. Symbol of knowledge. Symbol of warmth. Symbol of freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith as we gather here to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love.
Well, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Happy Sunday, June 28th, 2020. It's great that you can join us this morning via this unique Zoom communication format. I think we have at least 53 participants joining us this morning. Today is our first event in our 2020 Summer Forum Speaker Series. Our first speaker this morning is Paisley Rekdal, poet, author, University of Utah Department of English professor, and since 2017, Utah's Distinguished Poet Laureate. Paisley has written 6 books of poetry and 3 works of nonfiction. The title of her presentation this morning is Poetry and Faith. Paisley will read from her works for approximately 20-25 minutes, and then we'll take 1 minute for the offering. We may be meeting virtually this morning, remotely, via Zoom, but we are spiritually meeting within the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. After the 1 minute offering, Paisley will be happy to engage in a lively question and answer session. You all know that there's no such thing as a bad question. Please type your questions into the Q&A holding room, and I'll be happy to read them aloud as time permits. Okay, I'm happy to welcome our Summer Forum speaker this morning, Paisley Rekdal.
Thank you. Hello. I'm hoping you can all hear me and see me. I'm up at my cabin, so it's also a little windy, so I tried to close the windows, so hopefully it won't get too loud. I'm going to begin today with a poem from my collection, Nightingale. It's the opening poem, and it's a poem about faith. It's also a poem about creativity, because for me, those two things are somewhat linked. I was not raised in any particular faith at all. Actually, I was raised by atheists and then sent to Catholic school because they had a very strange sense of humor. But I spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to believe in something. And there's a tree across the street where I live in Salt Lake, and it's about that tree, but it's about more than that. Psalm. Too soon, perhaps, for fruit, and the broad branches, ice-sheathed early, may bear none. But still my neighbor waits with her ladder and sack for something to break, a gold, a lengthening of light, for the greens to burst into something not unlike flame. The pale fruit blushing over weeks through the furred, cleft creases, a freckling of blood. Then the hot, sweet scent of August rot, drawing wasps and birds and children through the month. So much abundance, and the only cost, waiting. Looking at the tree, I almost expect the sound of bells, a stone church, sheep and flocks, but no sound of bells, no clarion call. The church is far down in the valley. This tree should be an ancient, revered thing placed at the heart of a temple. Instead, it is on a common lot beside a road, apartment buildings, a dog sleeping in its yard. My neighbor has come here neither as master nor supplicant. She simply plans to fill a plastic sack with whatever she can take, the sweet meat giving under the press of a thumb, covering what is its true fruit, the little pit, hard and almond brown that I've scooped out, palmed and planted to no avail. A better gardener could make demands of such a seed, could train a tree for what desire anticipates, but here the tree grows only for itself. And if it bears no fruit for the killing frost or if it flowers late because of a too warm winter, what debt am I owed? At whose feet should I lay disappointment? Delight, no more comforting nor wounding than hunger. The tree traffics in a singular astonishment, its gold tongues lolling out a song so rich and sweet the notes are left to rot upon the pavement. Is this the only religion left to us? Not one only of mortification or desire, not one of suffering, succor, not even of pleasure. The juice of summer coils in the cells. It is a faith that may not come to more than waiting. To insist on pleasure alone is a mark of childishness. To believe only in denial, the fool's prerogative. You hunger because you hunger, and the tree calls to this. But the fruit is real. I have eaten it, have plucked and washed and cut the weight and stewed it with sugar and lemon peel until the gold ran rich and thick into jars. I have spooned it over bread and meat. I have sucked it from my husband's fingers. I have watched it sour in its pots until a mist of green bubbled up for a crust. I have gathered and failed it as the tree for me both ripens and fallows. But now it is perhaps too soon for fruit. The winter this year was hard, the air full of smokes. And do I know if spring reached the valley in time? Who planted this tree? How long has it stood here? How many more years can such a thing remain? My neighbor reaches a hand up into the branches, palm cupped, weighing the leaf knots. She is looking to see what instincts, what weathers still grow here. She snakes her hand through the greening branches. Up from the valley come the golden tongues of bells. This is a book that is thinking a lot about pain in a way, how we represent pain, how we deal with pain, how we think about pain, and whether pain changes us into something new, maybe some better version of ourselves, but sometimes maybe just makes us become the thing we already were. This is a poem that's a more personal poem, thinking about pain and how it works, and it worked in my family. We went through a fairly tough time. So this is a short poem called The Cry. A man can cry all night, your back shaking against me as your mother sleeps, hooked to the drip to clear her kidneys from their muck of sleeping pills. Each one white as the snapper's belly I once watched a man gut by the ice bins in his truck, its last bubbling grunt cleaved in two with a knife. The way my uncle's rabbit growled in its cage, screamed so like a child that when I woke the night a fox chewed through the wires to reach it, I thought it was my own voice frozen in the yard. And then the fox, trapped later by a neighbor, which thrashed and barked, as did the crows that came for its eyes, the sound of one animal's pain setting off a chain in so many others until each cry dissolves into the next grown louder. Even if I were blind, I would know night by the noise it made, our groaning bed, the mewling staircase, drapes that scrape against glass panes behind which stars rise, blue and silent. But not even the stars are silent. Their pale waves keen through space, echoing the dark the way my father's disappointment sags at my cheek and his brother's angers whiten his temple. And these are your mother's shoulders shaking in my arms tonight, her thin breath that drags out our window where coyotes cry, one calling to the next, their tender throats tipped back to the sky. This poem, I'm always thinking about the relationship between art and I guess a kind of suffering. Like oftentimes we write out of our greatest moments of joy, but also our greatest moments of crisis. And what does it mean to represent that. And when we want to write about or think about the suffering of other people, what lengths are we willing to go to? This is a poem based on an actual talk I attended given by an artist who was visiting Salt Lake City. And he was describing an actual piece of art that he created. And this was the story that he told. And as he was telling the story, I couldn't help but think, would I do something like this myself? It's called Horn of Plenty. Would you do what this artist did? The one who brought fresh goat's blood to pour over the cornucopia he sculpted in protest of the war, its dark mouth large enough for a yearling kid to sleep in, head tucked between the glossy hooves. For in his mind, the animal was clean, the farm a bright, mechanical place where anyone could buy clear bags of meat and blood. But the farm he found was poor, its owner's health failing, and so the artist, chagrined perhaps by his ambitions, watched as the farmer trudged into a muddy copse with a pail to pull two thin animals into his barn. Then he locked his knees around the smallest one's neck, its hips and triangular head twisting in his grip, so he levered the blade clumsily across the goat's gullet, forced now to saw through the tough neck muscles, the animal's head violently shaking no, 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 until the head pulled free and was thrown upon the ground. Then the farmer knelt down and punched his knife through the belly to pull out viscera, fresh and hot, the dark blood pumping into his pail as the other goat backed up against the far wall, screaming. Would you have chosen to stop? Or would you have continued, knowing you wanted the blood because of the horn, symbol both of plenty and of suffering, because it was a goat who nursed the god who snapped this horn off once in play, and blessed it later to be forgiven? That the horn recalled the grain of the once fertile nation your country has invaded, a country from which your government says it can't withdraw, its fields and infrastructure depleted by years of drought and war. The goat is ancient, milky-eyed. She's half blind, though she can smell what's happened to her companion. The whole barn is thick with the death that will now be hers. Would you keep on going? Does the first animal's suffering only make sense if you complete your art, finish the sculpture in a way the war will never be finished, the great horn clotted with blood and displayed in the foyer of the museum that commissioned it? The show will be titled after a line from the Iliad, freighted with dark pains, a description of the arrow shot by one soldier into the heart of another. The curators chose the title for the beauty of that line, perhaps for its suggestion that the body giving and the body receiving pain were equally blameless. Only the arrow delivers sorrow, only the arrow aches, as it rips through skin and muscle into the tender flank of the animal you are even now stroking in your arms. How can you not hush and cluck at her, soothing this goat the way you'd soothe the fears of anyone you loved, bending down to gather her body tightly against your own, because the animal is old, already dying, because you're tired of watching such frantic suffering, and because it is not your knife carrying the pain. That's a little bit darker than I probably should do on a Sunday morning. Okay, so I'm going to read something lighter and hopefully less terrifying. I'll start with a couple of sonnets. There was a PBS special on Mae West that has just started this last month. It's on the American Masters series, and I'm very delighted. I can't wait to watch it myself, because when I was a child, I was obsessed with Mae West, utterly obsessed with her. And I don't know how. I just started dressing up like her as a child. For the school talent contest as a kid, I would go as Mae West. I would impersonate her. I had wigs. My mom would buy me feather boas. And I still don't know how I even discovered her. My mom said I was sort of born doing a Mae West impersonation out of the womb, which that's a kind of terrifying idea in itself. But I wanted to write about that, my obsession with her. And one of the things that I found interesting about her is that she always played the same character over and over and over and over again. But I wanted to try and capture her humor. And so in the sonnet sequence that I wrote of her, most of the sonnets can only be composed of words that are using the letters in one of the one-liners, one of her famous one-liners that opens or closes the poems. And some of them are actually anagrams of her famous one-liners. I'm going to read you two poems that are anagrammatical sonnets, where I take a line that she had, and all the other lines in the poem can only be anagrammatical renderings of that line. So a couple of things about Mae West that you might not have known. One was she was a vegetarian early on, and she also believed very much in sunscreen, which she was ahead of her time in many ways. Mae West, advice. Ban tobacco, do bacon a bed, be delectable, collectible, a decent debacle. Décolleté don't conceal, acne do. Be bold and be toned, an octane blonde coed. Be colonel, not cadet, concede nada to doc, date a cad and canoodle, be a clat on a cot. Don't lean on a deacon, be adult, a clone, don't bet on an Eden, don't loot, don't loan. Be bell and ball too, a Deb cocoa labeled, be ocelot, be lancet, be candle and cabled. Cancelled, debated, booed at to boot, elect to be tall, don't tan, eat local. Be oded, caboodled, be beacon and lect. Don't be a noodle, be cool and collect. All right. And this is another one of the anagrammatical sonnets. And again, it ends with me doing a terrifying Mae West impersonation. Self-portrait as Mae West one-liner. I'm no moaning bluet, mountable linnet, mumbling nun. I'm tangible, I'm gin, able to molt in toto to limb. I'm blame and angle, I'm lumbago, an oblate mug gone notable, not glum. I'm a taboo tuba mogul, I'm motile, I'm nimble. No gab on we, no bagel bun boat. I'm one big megaton bolt able to bail men out. Gluten I am, male bong unit. I'm a genial bum, mental obi, genital montage. I'm Agent Limbo, my blunt bio, an amulet, an enigma. Omit Alan, omit bingo. Alien mangle, I'm glib lingo. Untangle me, Tangelo. But I'm no angel. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple of poems about one of the themes that Tim wanted to talk about as well today. Some people might know, some people might not know, I'm actually half Chinese. And the last couple of years, and I'm still working on this book, I was commissioned by the state of Utah and the Spike 150 commission to come up with a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. And I was very happy to do that for many reasons. I love historical research, one, but the other one is that the story of the Chinese railroad workers is one that people sort of generally know a little bit about it, and I know a little bit about it, but most people don't know a lot. And I wanted to spend a lot of time thinking about that. So the poem itself is actually a book-length poem. For the Spike 150 celebration, it was a multimedia poem, and it was based on a poem from Angel Island. And if you know anything about Chinese American history, you'll know that Angel Island was the Ellis Island of the West. Chinese immigrants during the Chinese Exclusion Act were held sometimes up to 2 years in a very small army barracks on an island off the coast of San Francisco. A lot of the people who were housed there were not allowed to work, not allowed to communicate with other people outside of Angel Island. And they began to carve poems into the walls of Angel Island, and they didn't often sign their own names. Some of the poems were poems that they had memorized themselves. Some of them were poems that they had written. So I took one of those poems, those Chinese poems, and I translate the poem character by character into a series of poems that examine the cultural effects of the Transcontinental Railroad on American culture. This poem that I'm going to read for you is the translation for two characters that translate literally to have knowledge. And it is based on the immigration questionnaire given to Chinese entering or re-entering the US during the Chinese Exclusion Act. Many of the lines are directly from that immigration questionnaire. Have knowledge. Have you ridden in a streetcar? Can you describe the taste of bread? Where are the Joss houses located in the city? Do Jackson Street and DuPont run in a circle or a line? What is the fruit your mother ate before she bore you? How many letters a year do you receive from your father? Of which material is your ancestral hall now built? How many water buffalo does your uncle own? Do you love him? Do you hate her? What kind of bird sang at your parents' wedding? What are the birth dates for each of your cousins? Did your brother die from starvation, work, or murder? Do you know the price of tea here? Have you ever touched a stranger's face as he slept? Did it snow the year you first wintered in our desert? How much weight is a bucket and a hammer? Which store is opposite your grandmother's? Did you sleep with that man for money? Did you sleep with that man for love? Name the color and number of all your mother's dresses, now your village's rivers. What diseases of the heart do you carry? What country do you see when you think of your children? Does your sister ever write? In which direction does her front door face? How many steps did you take when you finally left her? How far did you walk before you looked back? I was really struck by that immigration questionnaire because obviously it was based on the idea that a lot of Chinese were, for a while, moving back and forth between China and the United States. And that was the story of my grandmother. My great-grandfather moved his family to the United States, and my grandmother was born actually in Ellensburg, Washington. So she was an American citizen, but she went back to China after my great-grandfather died, and then she came back. So I'm always fascinated by the story of that sort of transnational migration back and forth, the moving between those two countries, and the idea that your cultural authenticity or your cultural inclusion would be based on how Americanized you already could be or were. This is a poem from my collection Animal Eye, which thinks about my grandfather, my Chinese grandfather's experience in America. Unlike my grandmother, he was not born in America. He was born in Guangzhou, China, and he came over early as a paper son, which is that he came over illegally. He was bought, I guess, as a child by another family who wanted a son. So his story is quite interesting, but I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up, almost every weekend. And one of the things that I remember about my grandfather was he was just this very imaginative, very artistic man. And he grew the most amazing garden. And he collected stamps, he collected fish, he made, aquariums for his fish. And he was always like relentlessly curious. And I remember having lots of conversations with him. But it wasn't until much later in my life that someone said, oh, it's too bad your grandfather didn't speak English. And I don't remember him struggling with English. And I don't remember suddenly, weirdly, what language we were speaking in. But I never remember him being inarticulate. But that memory was altered. My memory of him was altered by that comment. So this is a poem for my grandfather. It's called The Orchard. Even in the dream he's old, returning from his shed with a bucket of grubs he's picked off the roses. Dead already these 20 years, in my dream he moves steadily enough through the back field landscape clear to the power lines that march the length of Beacon Hill. My grandfather tended an apple orchard there, then set to making rows for sweet pea vines and tomatoes, though his wife complained of this cultivated Eden, worrying it looked too country to to the neighbors. In the winter, my grandfather ordered seeds from a company out west, and all summer and partway through fall sprayed the fruit with a thick mist the catalogs recommended until, years later, hard, berry-sized tumors grew in his pancreas and his wife's small breasts. In the dream, he wears one of the thin t-shirts he favored, the raveled neck gone transparent at the seams, below this a familiar pair of faded slacks, Mao blue, my uncles ruefully called them, bought in Beijing during the Reagan era. He'd returned a final time to see his mother, and for gifts brought back Mao jackets and caps, Mao mailbags and figurines my uncles and mother promptly buried inside closets and dressers. On the fireplace, the last framed photos of his mother before the children packed them off, the woman shaped spidery with age, slim feet bound in black. She died twice the summer he visited, the first after a stroke from which he revived a day later in the village's burial hut. My grandfather was good, I remember, at fixing bicycles and making shelves. He could replace a car clutch and once devoted an entire basement wall to a series of aquaria he'd built himself and stocked. None of these interests did he pass on to his children. He sat instead quietly through dinner, fingering his dish of salted plums, slipping each from its waxed paper to suck the meat to a pulp full of the brined, tart juice of summer. Though he wouldn't have been able to tell this toward the end, the pesticides, the chemo having poisoned his taste buds, perhaps his tongue. For in the dream, as in my memories of him, he remained speechless, one thin figure working in the garden or basement, the neighbor's hissed assessment of him filtered through the juniper hedge he'd planted as a border to gate our garden. Such an odd man. He seems intelligent, though who can tell, him unable to speak a word of English. So that I was startled 2 years later, coming upon his notebooks to find blazons of Chinese and English blooming alongside depressions, photos of Depression-era girlfriends clipped and pasted in satellite configurations on black paper filigreed with white paint. Curlicues of dragon's tails, emperor's rose trellises. The English so carefully rendered, so perfectly phrased that now, besides his secret art, it is my lack of remembering this voice myself that most disappoints, his silence renewed in imagination that renders me similarly dumb. In the dream, my grandfather holds out a box filled with stamps torn off missives from Taiwan and Russia, Denmark, Sweden, each one faded, yet folded carefully up, some in onion skin, their water stains and ancient postmarks like pressed flowers from a winter garden. Whose stamps were these he wanted me to see? Why did he believe such minutiae needed preserving? I take the box, ignoring his long face, looming in a worry over my own, attracted by the sudden stellar's jay that startles past his window. I look, and the box slips from my laps, spills its stamps like a spray of feathers from the bird that has begun feasting now on the apples in a corner of the orchard. Its dark head darts into the branches for the fruit before the bird rises again, flies off, its wings shuddering their streaks of blue that fade into the darkness. And I'm going to end with a final poem from Nightingale. And the only thing you need to know about this poem is I used to live in Wyoming before I moved here. And one of the things that I did in Wyoming was I took up archery, and I would go to the archery studio, and next to me were these bow hunters. And I was fascinated by the ways that they trained, that they would practice shooting their bows and their arrows against on a screen of these, elk and deer, and they would practice to see if they would get a kill shot. And so I was really fascinated by that video. And so this is a poem about that. It's also after the poet Carl Phillips, who also wrote a poem about memory. And so it's called Quiver. What do we do with memory? Do we burn Or do we embellish it? Do we study it as we do the elk projected onto the archery studio screen? Summer's gelatin halo shivering between the antlers, replayed whether or not anyone will come to practice on or witness it. Is this what memory is? Static, unchangeable mind we step into and the clearing opens. Again, light rain, the scent of moss, puffs of steam rising off the slick black muzzle. Does the image over time brighten so feverishly inside us, tearing through the eye, the mind, the body? Is it we who wander out now, tentative into late morning light? What does it mean to forget so much, happily, greedily, if not that we are nourished most on loss? The video spools, the elk steps into, then out of its field. Who cares? It was dead the second the camera found it anyway, captured and projected endlessly so that we might practice making it dead again. Is this the image to convince you of the blinding limits to our world? Is this another entry to your newest opening? The animal turns, the screen inside its body shakes, open, bright, pocked by tips of arrows that never find their mark. Thank you very much.
Paisley, thank you. Thank you. As I said earlier, we're going to take 1 minute now for the offering, and then we'll have announcements, brief announcements, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Okay, so with that in mind now, 1 minute for the offering.
Hi.
Okay.
I wanted to remind people before we start the Q&A that we're going to have a coffee hour after this. The coffee hour will be on Zoom meeting instead of Zoom webinar, so that you will all be able to see each other, because right now the attendees cannot see each other. And we will post the link to the coffee hour in the chat window. I'm going to do that in a minute. It's also on the reminder email that you should have gotten this morning or yesterday or sometime. So if you have any questions about how to access it, you can ask the panelists or the ushers in the chat. And thank you for your patience as we learn how to use Zoom webinar. I just don't want to take any more time. We'll turn it over to Tim and our guest speaker, Paisley. Thank you.
And Paisley, I think I'll ask for your response to this question. You are Utah's Poet Laureate, and James Baldwin made this observation about poets. He said, "The poets, by which I mean all artists, are finally the only people who know the truth about us. Something awful is happening to a civilization when it ceases to produce poets. And what is even more crucial, when it ceases in any way whatever to believe in the report that only poets can make." What is your response to James Baldwin?
Well, far be it from me to disagree with James Baldwin. I very much agree with that sentiment. I mean, I think what he's highlighting and understanding about artists and poets is that we are people who spend a great deal of time thinking closely about language and thinking very closely about events as they unfold, and also making connections between the events that we're living in right now to other events, to other people. In some ways, I think artists and writers are conduits for connections between communities and connections between different historical moments in time. And, you know, better or for worse, we carry historical memory forward. It's not just the work of historians. And I think that culture relies upon people who want to preserve that memory and want to share that memory and want to make that memory include as many people as possible. And just as a poet, I think, again, that attention to language is so crucial, because I think we see the daily effects of what happens when people use language carelessly, cruelly, thoughtlessly, and when they deploy language as a weapon. And the results of that can be, deadly in some cases.
I have a question. What got you interested in poetry in the first place?
Well, I started writing poetry in high school. It was an extra credit assignment, actually, and I did it. And then we sent the poems into a contest, and I won the contest. And it was the very first poem I'd ever written. It's probably a terrible way to get into poetry, because it gives you this idea that somehow poetry is nothing but awards and prizes. And in fact, most of poetry is like failure. But one of the things that I started, doing after that was looking into poetry and thinking about, well, why did I win a contest? What is this? And my mom was an English major, and she had books all around the house. And so I started picking up books of poetry, and actually, this sounds more precocious than it really was. She had a copy of Dante's Inferno with the illustrations, and it was really the illustrations that got me. And some of the language, I mean, if you want to get into poetry, reading about hell and then seeing all of these terrifying depictions really will bring your imagination to life. So I just kind of kept writing and reading. And what I fell in love with was the privacy of poetry. One of the things that I really appreciated about it is that, when you're writing it and when you're returning to it, it's a meditative practice. And there's almost nothing else in my life, I think, that allows me to spend that much time being careful and thoughtful. And I really appreciate that.
Okay. Follow-up question. What is it like to be Utah's Poet Laureate? What do you get to do in that position?
Well, I've been very fortunate. My term has coincided, obviously, with the Transcontinental Railroad celebration. And there were just a tremendous number of activities around that. So I got to do a lot of things, like obviously writing the poem West that I read a small section from, and do a lot of research on that and do public presentations for that. So it really got me involved in thinking about the 19th century, the West, got me thinking about Utah history and of course Chinese history. More importantly, I also go to K through 12 schools around the state, and I lead poetry workshops and I talk with the teachers. I think even more important than speaking to students, which I actually like totally love. That's been the real delight, but is also trying to convince teachers that they can teach poetry to their students. I think a lot of teachers are really intimidated. So I've been doing a lot of that. And then the last thing I've done was create a website called Mapping Literary Utah. And you guys all look that up, www.mappingliteraryutah.org. And it basically is a web archive of Utah writers, past and present, from all the creative genres. And I am always trying to get more and more and more writers on that site. And you can read about it, you can look at it, and it's great. We have videos, we have samples of their work, we have their biographies, photographs, things like that. So it's what I want everyone in the state to be able to have access to is a sense of their own rich literary history. And that's really important to me. So that is, like, I think my most important project as Poet Laureate. There's over, I would say, about 150 individual poets and writers on that site right now, plus a number of cowboy poets, plus a number of performance poets and some Native American storytellers on there. So please take a look at that and share that site with people.
Great. Have you, as a poet, ever felt like a poet without poems?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think we all go through those periods of time where you don't have anything to write about. And this, I'm not going to lie, this last couple of years has been brutal. I mean, I've been grateful to be Poet Laureate and been given assignments and commissions to be able to focus my creativity and my attention, because if you just let me sit and write right now, I don't know if I could do it. It's a very hard period of time.
Okay, then perhaps a follow-up. How do poets like yourself confront the terror of being unable to put thoughts and feelings down on a blank page? Do you brainstorm? Do you read? Do you observe?
All those things. So I spend a lot of time on a very practical level. I have a couple of books. So if you're interested in doing this, you can buy this book called The Poet's Practice or The Poet's Companion. Both of those are really excellent books of craft, but they come with a ton of creative writing exercises on there. And you can adapt them for fiction too. Online, there's also Poets and Writers magazine. Every week has a series of writing prompts. And so I often will go to prompts where I'm like, you know, get sort of jolted into some sort of creative process. I read a lot. I don't read just poetry, because I find some of my greatest inspiration comes from reading nonfiction or science or, you know, history. I read a lot of art history and read a lot of history. And so there's things that really spark my imagination. I ended up writing a poem about the pandemic, not because it's our pandemic, but I was reading, I actually studied as a medievalist, and there was basically a princess, Princess Joan, who was married, English princess in 1348 during the Black Death. She was married off to a Spanish prince, but she died of the Black Death as her ship was basically docked. On the coast of France. And I was really interested in that. So I wrote a poem, a monologue from her perspective of being trapped in this ship and not knowing why she was trapped in the ship and what was going on. And so, you know, sometimes you can write about what's happening to you by writing about other people, other moments in time. Persona poems have been really helpful that way.
And related to this, a question is about COVID-19, the coronavirus. Is there a poem to be written that deals with that balance, that struggle between the best wealth being the best, being good health, between one's financial efforts and one's effort to just stay alive?
Yeah, there absolutely is. I haven't written it and I haven't quite seen it yet. I've seen a lot of poets keeping little fragmentary notebooks and sometimes publishing some of those fragmentary notebooks and about the experience of trying to take in the enormity of the pandemic on a day-to-day level. I haven't, you know, it's so recent. It's hard. I know there's a new anthology of poems that just came out, in fact, by Knopf, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's a collection of poems that poets have written in response to the pandemic. And I haven't seen it myself. I haven't bought that book yet, but that would be a good place to look for those kinds of poems. I do believe that those poems will be written for sure. What's interesting is that the 1918 flu pandemic produced almost no poetry and very little literature. And that was a direct response to the fact that the US government suppressed information in the media about the flu pandemic. They didn't want people to panic. And the result is there's almost no literature. So, yeah.
A methodology question following up for you. What's your process of writing poetry? Do you carry a recorder, a paper, a tablet? Do you, when you get that, I'm thinking of Plato saying that great writers write not from wisdom, but sudden genius and inspiration. Do you, when you're driving, do you pull over the side of the road? When you're in the shower, you get out and you write something down? If you wake up in the middle of the night, do you scribble that insight?
Yeah, I carry a little notebook with me. But the annoying thing is, oftentimes when I'm running, there's something about physical movement when I'm running or hiking. Oftentimes I'll figure out how to fix a poem, or I'll come up with an idea about how to write a poem. And so what I do is I just sort of chant in my mind the lines that I want. So when I come home, I can write them down as fast as possible. But it's funny, the sense of a poem, I know I have a poem because it feels like I have a poem. I don't know what I'm going to say. And oftentimes when I see an image or I get a line, I can feel it. It's like almost like someone once described it as a cold coming on, and it doesn't feel like that, but for me, but I know what they mean. It's like a bell going off. Like I know there's a poem there, and then I just start going. And the trick is, and it's a really hard trick the more I write, the trick is not to become conscious when you're writing it, that you just have to keep writing and not edit as you're writing. It's really tough to do that. Most people start editing as soon as they write. And if you know what you're going to say, it's no longer a poem.
Well, then to follow up on that, James Baldwin observed that poets and artists are here to disturb the peace. Disturb the peace. There is so much going on right now that is lacking peace. As you, as a poet laureate, how do you disturb the peace? I saw it, I heard it in one poem you read this morning for sure.
Yeah. I mean, oftentimes it's just trying to say what it is that most people don't feel comfortable saying. Disturbing the peace, I think we might imagine that as a very, large protest poem, like something like Amiri Baraka would write, or Sonia Sanchez, or June Jordan, something that really speaks very directly to something like the Vietnam War, or speaks very directly to racial violence in America. But sometimes they can be unsettling in other ways. Sometimes telling the truth about your family can be disturbing the peace. Sometimes saying the truth about your marriage, or the truth about your relationship, with God, would be disturbing a kind of peace in yourself. I think all poems disturb the peace in the sense that they ask you to consider the nature of an internal change. How has your mind been changed, or how are you changing the reader's mind as you're writing it? If you end in the same place you began, you didn't change. And there's nothing for the reader to be excited about. And the reader itself won't change.
You just used the word unsettling. And I'm seeing here a question from our minister, Tom Goldsmith, that the poem Horn of Plenty was powerful and quite graphic, with unsettling images. What was your relationship with Horn of Plenty as it was being written?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because as a writer, this is one of the reasons I keep going back and back and back to it. It is unsettling to write a description of violence. It was unsettling to listen to that artist describe what he did. And then when I wanted to turn it into a poem, I had to describe what he did. And by doing that, of course, I risk making it both beautiful, but also something that you, the listener, then imagine and hear and take into your own mind. And there's a way in which, if you write about violence wrong, you can create a kind of spectacle, voyeuristic spectacle. You can create something like a horror movie in which there's something graphic, but not necessarily something elucidating about that violence. And in that way, it indulges in the violence it's supposed to deconstruct. And so writing it, I was trying to figure out, how can I both write that scene of violence, but kind of question, why is this violence necessary? And as an artist, when you cause pain in order to somehow depict pain and critique it, aren't you just doing the same thing? Aren't you just involved in that cycle? So, I mean, at the end, what I hope people take away from that poem is not just not just the moral questionable, the morally questionable aspect of that artist, but the morally questionable aspect of me as the poet that would then do the same thing. I'm engaged in it just as much.
And to follow up here, Jim Caetano has asked that as a poet, how do you choose how much to risk wrapping your essential thoughts in a metaphor that may not be fully understood by your readers?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question too, because the trick is always believing that your reader will rise to the challenge of reading the metaphor. Um, the reality is that if you don't handle your metaphors well, so for example, the Chinese virus is a metaphor, um, that has very specific effects on people. They understand what you are saying even as you have not articulated it clearly. And if you make a thoughtless metaphor, it can be damaging. It could incite different types of emotions and feelings in the reader. But most poetic metaphors are walking an interesting line where they cull from the writer's private experience, but they often write into archetypal or culturally conceived um, images, sensations that we have affiliation, we have an idea about. So for instance, if you write about spring, we think about renewal, we think about youth, we think about things coming back to life. If we use the color green, we think about either jealousy or we think about youth and renewal. We write about winter, right? So we have these kinds of associations that are cultural, but they're also private because the poet is creating something about him or herself in that metaphor. So you have to trust that the reader can move between the personal, the private, and the public in those kinds of ways. And so you have to be aware of the connotations and the denotations of your words. And you have to really spend a lot of time thinking about that when you're putting those things together, so that you can help the reader come to that understanding where it won't be the exact same experience of your metaphor, but they certainly won't go off in the wrong path, if that makes any sense.
You've spoken about your Chinese ancestry, living with your grandparents and yourself. Do you write any poetry in Cantonese or in Mandarin?
No, I do not. I am not fluent in Chinese at all. What's sort of sad and funny is that my Chinese side of the family followed a very traditional Chinese American path, which was that they spoke Chinese at home in the house. The older people did with each other and a little bit to the children, but they wanted their children and their grandchildren to be assimilated. They wanted all of us to be American. And so they actively did not teach people, any of us, Chinese. And so my knowledge of Chinese is very scattershot, and it's a child's Cantonese. And when you study Chinese in schools, that's Mandarin. They don't teach you Cantonese. So I would never be able to do that. But I remember growing up, with my grandparents, and they would move between Chinese and Cantonese, but they would only speak Cantonese when they wanted us not to understand something fully, or they were really angry. So I had my associations with Chinese are really like, it's the language of anger and secrecy, which gives me kind of a very different relationship with that language, or food, So that's the other thing. Yeah.
We're almost at 11 o'clock. We're almost out of time. Could you speak briefly about what you have been doing at the University of Utah to be able to encourage students and the general community to become more aware and more involved in poetry?
Well, I mean, I teach poetry writing all the time, so that's just my job. It's my day-to-day job. But as poet laureate, and then also as a poetry professor, I've been asked to do, especially around right now, to do some free community workshops around racism, anti-racism, and poetry. And so I've compiled a whole group of basically 300 years worth of African-American poets together in an anthology to share with people. We'll read them. Students will write in response, things like that. As a poet laureate and as a professor, I see my duty as being sort of a people's poet. If you've got questions, email me. You can call me, well, they took away our phones, but you can email me questions about poetry. And I did that as well in Wyoming. I really enjoyed that. I think that people love poetry and they have very different relationships with it. And people are always hungry for more knowledge. And all of us up there are more than happy to share that knowledge because, poetry is a gift and art is a gift. And it's something that people should be able to enjoy in their own lives. And so we want to make people feel comfortable with it and to be able to write and read and feel like they have something to contribute to that conversation.
Quick, short question on content versus style. In reading your works, I notice most of it is more prose and not, say, specific rhyme scheme. Is that your style? Which is your preference?
I'm a very narrative poet. This is true. And so I use a lot of free verse, but in all three of these, well, on two of these books, Nightingale and Imaginary Vessels, there's a lot of sonnet sequences. And I do actually have a lot of wordplay, and I also have a lot of rhymes in certain other ways. So I move between all of them. Oftentimes I will say when I get stuck, I will turn to rhyme because you're so thinking about the gamesmanship of rhyme and meter that it turns your more conscious brain off, and so you can be creative.
In closing, just moments ago, you mentioned African American literature and poetry. And I might say today's New York Times book review, page 37 in hard copy, has reviews by Langston Hughes about James Baldwin and James Baldwin about Langston Hughes.
Yeah.
And I would encourage everybody to take a look at this. It's very, very wonderful to read. So yeah, we promised to start on time and end on time, Paisley, and it's 11 o'clock. And we want to thank you. Thank you so very much for being our first Summer Forums speaker.
Well, thank you for having me. All right.
Good luck to you.
Good luck to you. Bye-bye.